House of the Dragon possibly becoming an anthology series after they finished telling the story of the Dance of the Dragons is an interesting concept. Being a huge fan of Fire and Blood, I would love to see some of the other eras of Targaryen history on screen, and I can think of a few that I think have all the ingredients to make an interesting and compelling story without treading over the same ground House of the Dragon is covering with the Dance of the Dragons. In this video, we're going to take a look over the 300 years of Targaryen history in Westeros and pinpoint some key eras and events that I think have everything you need to make House of the Dragon a successful anthology series, should HBO or the writers go down that road. Now, looking back to the events before the Dance of the Dragons, a really obvious choice would be Aegon's conquest. It has some very interesting battles, such as the Field of Fire and the Last Storm, and we get to see the origins of places such as King's Landing and the formation of House Baratheon, with House of the Dragon running with the idea of Aegon's prophecy and the Song of Ice and Fire. Going back and learning more about what he knew and what he saw would be the logical next step. For me, the heart of House of the Dragon is the characters, and I think seeing the dynamic between Aegon and his sister wife would be great on screen. I personally think Visenya is a very interesting character, from her skill at arms and the vital role she plays in the rule of the Seven Kingdoms. We also have people such as Orys Baratheon, Aegon's supposed bastard half-brother and best friend. I think you could really create a compelling friendship between them. I do see some issues with Aegon's conquest, however, namely that we don't really know a lot about the man himself as a person and a character. What we know of him tends to be related to his relationships with people around him, so the writers would have to really flesh out his character. But for me personally, I like the fact he is a bit of an enigma and has an air of mystery about him. We also have the issue that the conquest only covers maybe a 3-year time span with a very narrow plot. Even if you have some setup at the start of the show before the conquest, and then delve a bit into Aegon's actual reign, I feel it would be challenging, but not impossible, to get more than 2 seasons out of it, without getting boring for casual audiences. Another really popular suggestion is the First Blackfyre Rebellion. We, of course, much like House of the Dragon, have some really compelling characters and a fascinating political situation when it comes to who should be king, Daemon II or Daemon Blackfyre. The whole complexity of the political situation that leads to the rebellion, for me, hits a lot of the same marks the conflict between the Blacks and the Greens does during the Dance of the Dragons. Plus, you also have the fascinating and complex family dynamic between the different Targaryen factions and the Blackfyres, as well as the Great Bastards. Covering this time period could also act as a prequel to any Duncan Egg spin-off that might happen. It would introduce key players such as Maekar, Baelor, and of course Brendan Rivers, aka Bloodraven, who not only plays an important role in Duncan Egg, but in the main books and the show as well. So I can see why this era would make a hell of a lot of sense. The time period just before House of the Dragon starts would also make a lot of sense to cover, given fans would have a lot of investment in it. We know that George R. R. Martin pitched the idea of the first season of House of the Dragon, covering the lives and relationships and the rivalry between Aemon Targaryen and Baelor Targaryen, the father of Rhaenys and the father of Viserys and Daemon, respectively. We could see the early lives of characters from the show, as well as the interesting relationship between their fathers. Plus, we also have the crazy shenanigans of Jaehaerys' younger kids, and how it even came to be that the Great Council would be needed to decide his heir in the first place. I love Jaehaerys, so seeing more of him on screen would be great, but I also love the opportunity to give some attention to good Queen Alysanne, and highlight how key and pivotal of a role she played in the development of Westeros. The show would still have some family drama and some room for more political intrigue, and of course some wars that need to be fought, as well as lots of shocking deaths. However, I think it would face some of the same issues we have with Aegon's conquest, and I don't think you could run it for more than maybe 2 seasons without adding in lots of padding and filler. But this really would depend how far back into Jaehaerys' reign you'd want to start. As much as I would love to see the whole of Jaehaerys' reign on screen, due to the sheer length and the huge amount that happens over that time, we're talking a 10-season show to cover it all. And given all the time skips and recasting that would need to be done to make it work, it doesn't really seem practical. Hence why a short-run show focusing on Aemon and Balon and the events that lead to the Great Council of 101 make a lot of sense. If you wanted to, you could go past the death of Aemon and Balon and into the early reign of Viserys. While Paddy Constantine is unlikely to pull off Viserys in his teens and 20s, you could easily bring him back in the build-up to the Great Council and show the early years of his reign, and maybe even possibly Rhaenyra as a child. Again, as cool as that concept sounds, I think practically it'd be hard to pull off, hence why George wanted to focus House of the Dragon Season 1 on Aemon and Balon in the first place. But for me, there is one standout era that ticks all of the boxes: the Faith Uprising and the rule of Maegor the Cruel. The first season could focus on the late rule of Aenys and the events that lead to the Faith Uprising, and ultimately his death from apparent stress from the situation. What is great about this time period is we still have Visenya alive as a link to Aegon. I also think seeing the complex brotherly relationship between Aenys and Maegor would make compelling TV, but it goes further than this. We also have Jaehaerys and Alysanne being very young children at this point in time, giving us our direct link to episode 1 of House of the Dragon. But more importantly, we have Rhaena Targaryen, one of the most interesting and tragic characters in the expanded lore of Westeros. I have a feeling she'd be a fan favourite, capturing elements of why people love Rhaenyra, Daenerys and Rhaenys so much. She's the firstborn child whom questions and pushes her own right to the throne and that of her daughters. She seems to be linked to the hatching of several dragons, with her own dragon being the one to lay the eggs that would become Daenerys's. We have the question of her sexuality and complex relationships, not only with her husband, Aegon the Uncrowned, but later with Jaehaerys, Alysanne, and her own mother, Alyssa, as well. We also have her time as one of Maegor's 6 wives, and the whole Black Brides arc. Her story and character would be very compelling to see on screen, and I think she would be a fan favourite. In my head, the first season would cover the late rule of Aenys and the events that led to the Faith Uprising and his death. The second would be Maegor coming back from exile to take the crown, and his civil war with the Faith, and the conflict with the rightful king Aegon the Uncrowned at the same time. Then the third could be the Black Brides arc, the rise of Jaehaerys and downfall of Maegor. There is this very clear narrative structure with a defined start and end point, where the characters' journeys also coincide with this clear start and end. I very much see Maegor and Rhaena as the main characters, and think their relationship would be very interesting to watch. It would also be very cool to learn more about Maegor as a person, and see if he really lives up to the moniker of Maegor the Cruel, or if this is, as I have argued in the past, a possible case of history being written by the victors. I could see them making Maegor a very grey character in the sense he clearly does some bad and cruel things, but for the sake of the dynasty and House Targaryen. I personally have a feeling without Maegor, House Targaryen would have crumbled, and that he was a necessary evil. And this could really be the big question running through the series. Was Maegor a necessary evil? For me, Maegor on that dynamic transitional era would be perfect anthology material, different enough from the Dance of the Dragons while featuring many of the elements that fans love from the dance. Do you think House of the Dragon would work as an anthology series? Would you even want it to be one? And what era of Targaryen history would you like to see brought to life on screen? Let me know in the comments, as I plan on making a follow-up to this video with your input and ideas and suggestions.